Hello and welcome to an Infinity the Game list analysis video. In this video, we'll be talking about the Nomad list that won Interplanetario and why I think it's kind of genius. But to understand that, we first need to talk about the Interplanetario meta and story of Interplanetario this year generally. Interplanetario this year was a Steel Phalanx tournament. If you were watching standings from the event, you'll have seen a picture of the Kraken Masters tournament where sometime during the middle of the event, something like 7 of the top 10 players were Steel Phalanx players. Not just Aleph players, it was Steel Phalanx from left to right. It was the dominant faction in terms of standings, particularly as the event progressed, with really high Steel Phalanx performances from some very good players. However, Steel Phalanx didn't win Interplanetario. A Nomad list did. And in the basically day following the conclusion of the event, the narrative in the community was just a Nomad guided list has beaten Steel Phalanx. Steel Phalanx is OP, guided is OP, nerf Steel Phalanx, nerf guided. And this actually, I think, really tremendously misses some incredibly clever decisions that were made in this Nomad list that make it very much not just a guided list. And so I wanted to make this video to explore why I think the Nomad list that won the finals was incredibly well constructed, and although it did have a Vertigo Zond and guided missiles were definitely a big part of how it plays, there were decisions made in the construction of that list that were too clever to relegate it to just a guided missile list. That misses the whole picture, and it misses why I think this list absolutely deserved to win Interplanetario, given how basically good I assume the player that was playing it was in order to conceive of it and then pilot it to victory. So firstly, just a quick snapshot of what the Nomad list would be playing against. This is the Steel Phalanx list piloted by Sky Knight that would go into the finals. And it's a very, very good Steel Phalanx list. It's heavily focused around Combat Group 1 with just some reinforcement elements in Combat Group 2. If you look at Combat Group 2, you'll see 2 Flash Pulse remotes and a War Correspondent, which can perform a combination of picket duties and being shifted into Group 1 to make sure that it stays at maximum order count over the course of the game. Otherwise, in Combat Group 1, we can see a number of what we would call the standard all-stars of Steel Phalanx, in particular Machaon, Phoenix, and Uteros, who are just incredibly high value, incredibly resilient, incredibly durable, just really, really good, strong pieces that ask questions that some list can't answer. Phoenix in particular is a very, very strong piece in that his presence as both an active gunfighter and an ARO element just can't be answered by some lists. He's Mimetism 6, he's Ballistic Skill 14, he's Burst 2 with a template continuous damage weapon. There are plenty of lists in the game that have got, something like a Ballistic Skill 14 gunfighter, which just can't answer a BS14 Mimetism 6 ARO piece that's as tough as Phoenix is. And if Phoenix is being answered by something that's equivalent to him, he can respond with smoke. There are some cool flourishes in this list otherwise that I think are well worth noting. In particular, it's managed to include some guided missile play through Pandora, who is a linked pitcher, and the Samok Rebot, who is the guided missile remote for Steel Phalanx, but I don't think that's necessarily the focus. I think that's just something that is a nice to have. I would be kind of surprised if this list was considered a heavily focused guided missile list, although I have no doubt that if it wanted to, it could play games where perhaps the first turn was setting up some repeaters, firing some missiles, and not overextending elements. Because this list isn't running necessarily quite the same depth of durability that you might see in some Steel Phalanx list, it's much more of an all-star list. It doesn't have quite as many pieces that can be active because it has a thinner Combat Group 2. It doesn't have pieces like Agema or Ectremoy as single sort of spot attack / ARO elements. It's really going to want to keep that essential core intact and alive. I can see how Guided Missile could be useful as an early sort of play during the early part of the game in order to establish some advantage without exposing your very expensive pieces. But broadly, this is a Steel Phalanx list. It is trading on incredibly high quality characters, which are incredibly resilient, Mimetism 6 across the board, good gunfighting, good links, good order efficiency. In this case, we have both NCO and Tactical Awareness through Uteros and Akmon. Just a very, very solid list for almost any scenario. Now, in comparison, on the table here we have the list that we ran as Nomads in the finals of the Interplanetario, and it's a vanilla Nomads list. And although this list is very well set up to make guided missile attacks, I think it would be a huge misservice to describe this as just a guided missile list, or just a guided missile list 1 Interplanetario. Let's go through the pieces and we'll talk about why I think this is really, really clever. So what we have in Combat Group 1, we have one of 2 Hecklers with Fast Panda and Jammer. We have 2 Moderators, one of whom is the Lieutenant. We have Zoe and Pywell. I've reconstituted this list. I assume Zoe was the boarding shotgun, probably not the combi, but it's the same cost either way. We have Fiddler with both of her jackpots. We have an Intruder heavy machine gun, the Vertigo Zond, a Morlock. Again, I've assumed it's an Assault Pistol Morlock, but really it could have been any of the 6-point profile ones. And then in Combat Group 2, we have Armand Lemuet, Jazz and Billy, 1 Moran, a Morlock, and a Heckler. Now, in general, I find that if a Nomad list has 1 Moran, it's probably a really, really good list, because it means that the Nomad player has made some very conscious decisions around troop slots, SWC, and points, and 1 Moran can actually absolutely be enough in many circumstances. 2 is kind of just like crutch piece / comfort zone territory. 1 really can do the job, and so I have a lot of, I'm very interested to see lists like this, because they're probably highly, highly refined. Now, this list absolutely does have really good guided missile attack projection. It doesn't just have the Moran, it has 2 Hecklers, and to note, something that's really clever here is that the Hecklers are split across combat groups. It also has 2 high-quality hackers, which are split across combat groups, and it has the ability to lay smoke, again split across combat groups. It's running a 9-6 split. So it's very hypothetically possible for this list, for example, to have its secondary combat group maybe lay some smoke, or just move the Heckler forward, place down a Fast Panda, and then use the first combat group to use Whip 15 hacking from Zoe and the Vertigo Zond. If it's beginning to fail, if Zoe isn't landing them, you can fall back and make maybe a couple of spotlights with Jazz, and then force the missiles through with the Vertigo Zond. Yes, this list absolutely can spend 15 orders or 13 orders on the first turn just setting up and firing missiles. That is something they can do, and that may have been something that happened in the finals. Wasn't there, didn't see it, but that overlooks what is really clever about this list. What is clever about this list is that it is intensely well tailored to the opposition it was going to face at Interplanetario. There are 2 or 3 pieces in particular here that cannot be overstated how much of a niche pick that they are in general terms, but are incredibly clever in the context of Interplanetario. And those are, to one extent, Fiddler, but more importantly, the Intruder and Armand Lemuet. None of these are necessarily bad pieces, and Armand is a piece, for example, and actually the Intruder is a piece that I've had locals experiment with just kind of in general, but they are pieces that are very, very, very good if your intention is to have a list that can kill Steel Phalanx. And to even get there in the first place, you have to recognize that you are going to be playing against Steel Phalanx, which means that, among other things, Weran had a very, very good read on what he was going to be playing against at Interplanetario, and not every player will have had that. For example, many of these people who were playing Steel Phalanx, the question is, did these Steel Phalanx players build lists to fight against Steel Phalanx? And I suspect some of them did, and in fact the list that we just saw, with the presence of guided missiles, for example, gave it some additional teeth against Phalanx, but I reckon many of the Phalanx lists that fell away over the course of the tournament weren't optimized for fighting in the mirror match. And what Werin has done here by including the Intruder and Armand Lemuet is give him multiple pieces that can actually really effectively engage Steel Phalanx from multiple combat groups. He has a level of redundancy to challenge Steel Phalanx in both active and reactive turn, which just most lists won't have. If you are running kind of like a cookie cutter kit, a cookie cutter Nomad list, for example, that has like one tag as its gun, and some guided missiles and some Morlocks, that's a perfectly serviceable list. And you know what? In a pinch, I reckon that could go. It could go toe to toe against the list that Sky Knight bought for Steel Phalanx. But this list is built to prey on Steel Phalanx really efficiently. If the Vertigo Zond is destroyed somehow, or Steel Phalanx managed to do something where they hit you really hard and they take out a key piece in your guided missile net, probably the Vertigo Zond, to be perfectly honest, you are still totally in the game because you have these pieces that can very, very effectively engage Mimetism 6 gunfighters. The Intruder is going to be firing on 13s versus Phoenix, who will be on 11s, 4 dice to 2. That's a favorable gunfight. Now, the Intruder might just die. It's a single wound piece. It's not necessarily perfectly optimal, but it is very, very good if what you're doing is playing against people who are going to be bringing pieces like Phoenix. And if you, for example, use missiles to kill one Steel Phalanx troop in that 4-person core link and take it down to a 3-person link, then all of a sudden the intruder is getting full value from smoke shooting and can really take out a piece like Phoenix. Armand Lemuet, for his part, is similarly a script flipper, where he has an MSV and Mimetism 6 himself. Could potentially be used as an ARO piece in a pinch. He's a Toha model. He can take a wound and go down, although I wouldn't necessarily be inclined to do that because you'll be playing against Phoenix a lot of the time and the templates will just take you out. But as an active turn piece that can spend a couple of orders from the second combat group, which has 6 orders, Armand Lemuet can threaten Phoenix. He can threaten Phoenix like quite effectively. It's not a perfect face-to-face roll. It's 2 dice versus 2 dice, but Armand will be on 10s and Phoenix will be on 8s. Again, that's a little close for comfort, but just having a gun that really does have favorable odds against Phoenix is enough to make the Still Phalanx player reconsider things. And although Still Phalanx has a nice mix of Eclipse and regular smoke, Armand as an ARO piece could potentially, if you can outrange Phoenix in particular, if you have maybe Armand as a reserve drop, then and you have a position where you can put Armand down that is at like 33 or 36 inches from a piece like Phoenix, you're actually comfortable using him as an ARO piece because Phoenix is now rolling to hit on something like 2s. You can generally, like, you're forcing the smoke out at that point. Now, would I recommend Armand Lemuet and an intruder in every list? No, but you have 2 lists. And Interplanetario was effectively a 7-round event, something like that. It was like 2 rounds day 1, 3 rounds day 2, 1 round and a finals on day 3, which means that if you're taking 2 lists into that, the idea that both lists are generalists but tailored, as in scenario generalists, but tailored for opposing forces, means that you are in a much better situation than if you're trying to say, I'm going to have one list that can do 5 scenarios and one list that can do 2. In a 7-round, 7-scenario event, having something like this where you're like, yep, I can play this against, like this would also, for example, playing this into Toha, I think this would be incredible into Toha, because you have Toha with, like, Toha are in some respects they're stronger than Phalanx, but in some respects they're budget Phalanx, where you have smaller links with less mimetism, but still multiple wounds, etc. The difference is that Toha can play wider and have some unique stuff in Ferroware. Toha are very, very strong. This list could definitely play into Toha. Like a Suquale on Overwatch, like a Suquale missile launcher on Overwatch, gets annihilated by this list. A Nikul on Overwatch gets annihilated by this list, because you just throw smoke in front of the intruder and the intruder kills them both. Like, unless they crit, you're golden. So having this as a drop for Phalanx and Toha and some other piece similar, like this is just really good design. And then in terms of, it can do many missions, it's got comfortable specialists, including mobile resilient specialist in the form of Fiddler. And then finally, just to mention Fiddler herself, once you've suppressed or challenged Overwatch from a player like Toha or a Phalanx player, you need something that can actually go in after the pieces that are hunkered down, because there reaches a point where missiles have significantly they have diminishing return. If you are trying to guided missile every single piece in a 5-person Phalanx link, it's going to take you 2 turns to do that. It just takes far, far, far too long. You can disrupt your opponent's plans. You can pick out key pieces. You can be like, I'm going to kill McKayon. I'm going to kill the link leader in that Phalanx link so I can shoot the other pieces. You can't realistically be like, I'm going to kill all 4 of those models in 1 turn with guided. That isn't going to happen. So when the game is getting scrappy, what you need is a piece that can go in after them and challenge and like take down the remnants, the very, very dangerous remnants of that original Phalanx core. And Fiddler's jackbots in particular are exceptional at that, because they have +6 to hit in short range, template, like armor piercing, burning. They can just go in against Phalanx pieces and take them down. They can force dodges, and then they can favorably fire against those dodges thanks to +6 range bands. In addition, Fiddler is a very good defensive piece. In fact, this list generally defends beautifully, where you can do things like you can layer the jammer area of hecklers with template defense from the jackbots. There's one Moran, there's the crazy koalas, etc. This list, I think, it doesn't have a ton of wounds, but it's not short on them either, thanks to Fiddler bringing those ablative ones. This list can probably defend quite effectively against a wide variety of targets. The only thing that it's maybe potentially missing, no, what I'm talking about, it's got two deployment zone repeaters from the 2 remotes, Zoe, Pywell, and Billy. So it's even got ample deployment zone repeater coverage. So look, generally, that basically wraps up my conclusion. The overall takeaway that I want to make here is that to look at this list and say, this is a guided missile list, horribly, horribly overlooks some absolute genius that has gone into the crafting of this list, and multiple levels of redundancy that Weran included in this list to allow them to, like, really play into the dominant meta. And what that means is that Warren had to realize what the dominant meta was and prepare for it effectively. And they were rewarded for that. They won Interplanetario using this list plus one other. And this list going into the finals against a Steel Phalanx player, like I am not surprised that they win. Sky Knight was obviously a very good player to get all the way to the finals. They had very clever decisions in their list, including things that would let them play effectively into the Steel Phalanx mirror. But this Nomad list is a work of art, and to dismiss it as a guided missile list really overlooks clever decisions that went into it, with the inclusion of niche picks like the Intruder, Armand Lemuet, and to a lesser extent Fiddler. Fiddler is very good, but you wouldn't see her in that many Nomad lists. So, like, overall, I just wanted to make a video about this. I was really enthused to see this list. It was very cool. It was very good design. And I think it speaks to how careful planning and assessment and understanding the meta and building a list that can play into different opposing forces can pay dividends. So look, congratulations Skynet for making it to the final. Absolutely congratulations to Warren for winning Interplanetario 7. Very well done. Hope you all enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next time.